Having seen you all at the enthronement of His grace, which was so impressive, our people were just stunned by the appearance of 50 priests lining the central aisle there in the cathedral. It was really a beautiful moment. And again, in the space of less than 2 months, I look upon your lovely faces. My heart swells with joy. As you know, we've done everything possible to provide for you, to make you feel welcome and at home. And I think at this point you're becoming very much accustomed to the unique hospitality offered you meteorologically, which I tend to comment on year after year. But it was interesting this morning. I woke up, I looked out my window, I saw my daughter's car was iced over. I thought to myself, I don't remember them predicting freezing rain. I went downstairs and walked outside. It was sleeting. I thought, boy, this is strange, and then all of a sudden, it dawned on me. They're coming. The harbinger of your arrival. So we're here, the setting is familiar, we are comfortable with our two colors of gray and brown, and so we will proceed. So, in all seriousness, it's a true blessing to have you all, and we look forward to a wonderful time with Archimandrite Daniel.
Father Paul reminded me, your videos, if you've ordered videos, please see Father Paul. Probably on Wednesday, right, Father Paul? Yeah. Sometimes Wednesday afternoon or evening, and you can pick them up to carry home. If you remember, several years ago when His Grace Bishop Kalistos was with us, someone, I think it might have been McKay, asked me if I was going to the old country again that year. And I said yes. And His Grace said, oh, you're going to the Middle East. I said, no, Your Grace. For these men, the old country is England. And I was. We've had, over the past several years, a number of our speakers come from England. We're enamored of people who speak properly, I think. As I said this evening after Vespers, we will be meeting, we'll be introduced to and be meeting and spending time with members of our family of faith, members of our body, and we members of their body, as being all members of the body of Christ, some of which we might have heard before, some of which we have read their names and wondered how to say them. This should be a fascinating several days for all of us. I want, by way of introducing Father Daniel, just to give a little introduction to Christianity in the British Isles, just to put him in context, and then he will put himself in context, specifically in Wales. In AD 43, the Emperor Claudius, the Emperor of Rome, conquered Britain. Some of his soldiers, as early as AD 43, are known to have been Christians. They were certainly among the earliest Christians then in Britain. While there's no physical or archaeological evidence for Christianity in Britain that can be dated before the 4th century, there is literary evidence of an organized church in Britain at a very early date. Christianity was especially popular in the Roman garrison towns, such as Dorchester and Silchester and Winchester, and it was planted in a fertile spiritual soil. The blood of her martyrs abundantly watered the Church of Britain's tender shoot. St. Alban, a young Romano-British soldier, was found giving refuge to a priest during the persecution of the Christians in Britain under Emperor Septimus Severus in the year 209. As a result, St. Alban was arrested and tortured and finally beheaded, earning for himself the title the proto-martyr of Britain. When Roman Britain became seriously threatened by attacks from the barbarians, the British Church appears to have retreated to relative obscurity into those areas which had never fully come under Roman control: Cornwall, Wales, Cumbria. Moving south, we find in AD 580 now, the 6th century, Ethelbert, the heir to the throne of Kent, marrying a Frankish bride, Bertha. Bertha's father had been king of Paris in her infancy, but he was now long dead. The princess had been brought up near Tours, where St. Martin had been bishop 2 centuries earlier. One of the conditions of the marriage was that Bertha should be able to continue to worship as a Christian. A chaplain therefore accompanied her to Kent, and King Ethelbert gave her a former Roman stone building beside the Canterbury to Richborough Road as her royal chapel. Around this same time, the late 6th century, St. Pope Gregory the Great, or the Dialytus as some of us know him, had his first contact with the English when he saw 3 fair-headed, blue-eyed English boys in the slave market in Rome. Asking about them, he was told that they were Angles, or English. He replied that they had the faces of angels, and, quote, therefore ought to be fellow heirs of the angels in heaven. So in the spring of AD 596, he blessed a group of 40 monastics to make a missionary journey to Britain. Bishop Augustine, now known as St. Augustine of Canterbury, headed this mission team from the Church of Rome. In May AD 597, St. Augustine and his 40 companions, together with their Frankish interpreters, arrived in Britain on the shore of the island of Thanet. Hearing of their landing, King Ethelbert ordered them to remain there. Venerable Bede tells us that this thing happened next. Quote, some days later, the king came to the island, and sitting in the open air, commanded Augustine and his companions to come thither and speak with him. They came, bearing as their standard a silver cross and the icon of our Lord and Savior painted on a panel. They chanted litanies and uttered prayers to the Lord for the eternal salvation, both of themselves and of those to whom they had come. End of quote. The king then escorted them back to his city and established their mission base in Queen Bertha's chapel of St. Martin of Tours. This same St. Martin's church in Canterbury survives until today, the oldest church temple still in use in Britain. At the same time as Roman Christianity was spreading in the south, Celtic Christianity returned to Scotland in full force with St. Columba, who founded the island monastery of Iona. Later, at the invitation of St. King Oswald of Northumbria, St. Aidan came from Iona to establish a monastery on Lindisfarne, known as the Holy Island, from where he preached the gospel to the heathen Anglo-Saxons. In a short time, by the grace of God and through their preaching, the lives of many holy men and women, by the lives of many holy men and women, the entirety of the British Isles became a brilliant gem, the diadem of Christ's Holy Church. For centuries, in recent times, the Orthodox roots of Christianity in what we now know as the British Isles was either ignored or most likely largely forgotten. And along with the history of their roots, the heroes of the Orthodox Church of the British Isles became strange to the inhabitants of that land. St. John the Wonder Worker of Shanghai and San Francisco said that orthodoxy will return to those islands and Christianity will flourish there once again when the people of those islands again love and venerate their own saints. There is no part of those islands that has had more saints walk upon the land, who have more towns and villages named for them than Wales. This evening we are blessed and honored to have here in the heartland of America. Our orthodoxy is new. You know, we brag, right, that our diocese is 100 years old. It took 100 years, that's all, from when our first priest came to this area. 100 years is nothing in Wales. They have pots in their kitchens that are We are so fortunate to have come among us really a lover of the saints, someone who is himself a hero for Holy Orthodoxy in that land, blessed by the lives of so many men and women who lived lives as Christians. Father Daniel himself is a native of Wales. He's a Welsh speaker. In the best sense of the word, he's a Welsh nationalist. And I say in the best sense of the word because he knows where Wales has its riches, and that's in her spiritual history and in her saints. How many hundred years, Father, was it from the time that the Welsh Parliament had been suspended until it was reconvened?
700.
700 years, similar to the Parliament of Scotland, right? The Parliament had been not only suspended, but disbanded. And several years ago, the Welsh Parliament was reconstituted. And of all the people who could have been invited to come and to offer the prayer to reconstitute the Welsh Parliament, they invited Father Daniel. And for the first time in probably more than 700 years, in the gathering of the members of Parliament from throughout the country of Wales, Father Daniel led them all in prayers asking the intercessions of the saints to whom we will be introduced this evening. Father Daniel himself is a parish priest in Wales, in a slate mining town. But in addition to that, he's also the director of, the founder of it. It belongs to him, it's his vision, of something much bigger than just the parish church in one Welsh town. And it's the Wales Orthodox Mission. We will be having among us later this week a crew from television in Wales that's here to follow Father Daniel as he exposes us to the spiritual treasures of Wales. He's a very well-known figure, very highly respected figure in Wales, as you can imagine, being the only clergyman invited to come and make the opening prayer for the Parliament. Again, we're honored, Father Daniel, by your presence. We thank your parishioners who have done without you now this week, and so that we might have you to nourish us and to nurture us in the lives and spirituality of the saints of Old Britain. Join me in welcoming Father Daniel.
Your Grace, Bishop Basil, and dear brothers in Christ, it's a very great honor to have been invited here. And I come with some trepidation because the subject that I'm to talk about is a very big subject, and I'm very moved by the fact that there should be so many Orthodox clergy who have an interest in this topic. It's difficult to conceive of there being a group of 60 people, especially clergy in Wales, of any denomination, who would want to gather together to hear of this. And so it's very moving for me that you should want to be addressed on this topic, and I feel very inadequate. I'm also not an academic. I've been out of academic life for many years, really, although I have been teaching in high school for many years too. But I'm not an academic, and I was discussing this meeting with a friend of mine, a Catholic monk, and he said, you should introduce yourself and put yourself in context first. And I thought perhaps I should do that. And it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about where I come from, not just geographically, but historically and spiritually. So I'm going to do that, although I don't enjoy talking about myself, but I will in this context. I must also say that it's a great pleasure specifically to be in Kansas. Because for many years of my life, it was the only place in the United States I'd ever heard of. Because as a small child growing up in Wales, living next door to my grandparents, who had lived in Topeka, Kansas for 3 years, it was the only place they spoke of. I was brought up with the sound of Topeka, Kansas in my ears. And I can hardly believe that, as so often seems to happen in church life, things come round their full circle. And as I explained to Father, where is he now, the parish priest, as I was explaining to Father a few minutes earlier, had the climate suited my grandmother better, I would perhaps now be the parishioner of yours in Topeka. However, this is just to give you some idea of what a joy it is to be here and what a joy it was to have Bishop Basil stay with me 2 years ago. I only wish we'd had more time to look at more places, but obviously the places that we visited engendered some interest, and we can start on our journey. Perhaps I should explain to you why I'm in the town of Blaenau Festiniog. So I brought some pictures here, just to show you a few photographs of the area and a few historical sites that are pretty near and that are part of my immediate context. This is is.
If you want to take control now, you can.
No. But why not take a seat? Okay. So this is a typical scene in North Wales. That's the highest peak there, I think, is Snowdon, which is the highest mountain in England and Wales. And that'll be a typical scene this time of year. It was very much like that when I left this weekend. So that's the sort of area I live in. The town which I live in is in the middle of that sort of countryside. Yes, and that's the church which we're in the process of restoring. It was a closed Anglican church that had been empty for 7 or 8 years. And the small chapel which we had in the house in which I live, and which had once been a shop, we felt was inadequate in the long term, because people are not used to churches in houses. They want to see a building which is recognizable as a church. And people were always saying, Tad is the Welsh for Father, Tad Daniel's church. And I kept on saying, not Tad Daniel's church, God's church, yes, but in Tad Daniel's house. So we had to get it out of the house. We still have the small church in the house, dedicated to the protecting veil of the Mother of God. But this church, which was in a very bad condition, was on the market. And a member of the parish said, why don't you look at that church that's for sale down the road? You're always looking at these nonconformist chapels which are not suitable for conversion. And that's very suitable. It has an apse and everything. So I went and had a look, and they said, oh, it's just been sold. So rather smugly I replied, oh, I've inquired, it's been sold, having a feeling that I'd done my duty. However, 6 months later it was still for sale, and I thought, in all honesty, I must inquire again. And I inquired again, and they said, oh, the sale has fallen through, they said, and it's for sale again. I said, how much are they asking? And they said, well, they're asking £15,000, which is what, $30,000? And so immediately, my immediate reaction to such a bargain as this, being a true Welshman, was, will they come down in price? They said, oh, yes, they'll come down, yes. All right. They'll come down to 10,000? Oh, yes, down to 10,000. How about 5,000? You can't get a second-hand car for 5,000. Yes, oh, they'll come down to 5,000, yes. I said, how are you so sure that they'll come down to 5,000? Oh, that was the last price agreed. I thought I'm on a winner here. How about 2,500? He said, oh yes, that's fine, yes. I said, okay, 2.5 will be fine. So, at the time we had £250 in the bank account. And by the end of the week, without having asked anyone, we had 5,750 in the bank account. By the end of the same week, not having asked anyone for a penny, for a cent. And this is how we bought the church. There's a lot of work to be done on it. We've done the maintenance work. The TV people who will be here at the end of the week, who you'll be delighted to meet, and they will be delighted to meet you, are a very nice new Welsh television company. And their first commission was to make a program about the resurrection of this church. And they used the term resurrection as a symbol of the resurrection of the community. It's a depressed post-industrial community, and perhaps as a sign of spiritual resurrection in Wales. And the first of the two programs, well, the first having gone so well, they then got a commission to do a second, and their filming here will form part of the second one. In the first one we went to Macedonia, where we looked at frescoes 700-800 years old in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and that was broadcast exactly 2 weeks ago, on Tuesday of last week, and was well received. I had a letter a day or two before that from the Patriarch of Constantinople wishing us well with our program and saying it was a very good idea. The second program, of which my presence here will form a small part, or a significant part anyway, and in Southbound Brook, where we'll go after leaving here, will be in order to show that Orthodoxy is not only historical, but is contemporary. And to come here and to see a group of 60 clergy interested in hearing of the saints of Wales will be a very eloquent statement to the people of Wales that these saints are significant and important. And then also at the cathedral on Sunday. So I feel also very privileged to be amongst you. And I would like to thank you for the welcome you've already given me. What have we next, Father? Let's see. Well, that was the church when we took it over. That was the condition, and that and worse. And I've included this to show you where we are historically and spiritually. I'm going to use this board, if I may, for a second. Could I just... The map comes a bit later in these slides, but imagine that the town in which our churches are based and where I live is there. And it has a parish boundary, an old parish boundary from medieval times, and around it are other parishes with medieval boundaries. There are 6 in all. And this sort of chart which I made, like a wheel of a bicycle, each of these parishes has a name, and each of them has very interesting historical Christian remains. This particular one is from the parish here. It's called Pen. And these stones are very interesting. The church itself is closed. It's in a valley where almost every church is closed. The Protestant nonconformist chapels are all closed except one, and the Anglican church was closed even before them. But the building is there, and these stones are in the wall. And you see at the bottom, magistrat, a Latin word. This is a stone commemorating the burial of a Christian during the time that so-and-so was magistrat, a Roman title. And this is one of the main pieces of evidence that Christianity was in Britain before the Romans left. This stone is very important evidence of the very early presence of Christianity in Britain, while the Romans were still there during that period of occupation. So it's a very, very crucial bit of evidence, and it's in one of these churches very near us. Okay, this is an icon of St. Asaph, who's the patron saint of the medieval diocese. It's now an Anglican diocese immediately to the east of us. St. Asaph, he and St. Kentigern, known as St. Mungo from Scotland, are the patron saints of that diocese. Yes. And here's another stone, I think, probably from that church in Penmachno again. Very early archaeological evidence of Christianity being in Britain from the outset, from the early period. Yes, with a cross on it, early Christian cross. Thanks, Father. There's another stone from that church in Penmachno. I've got lots more images like this to show you, but you can just flick through them. Here they are, the stones from that church. We could speak, we could go on at length about these. It's enough for me now just to show you that they're there. That's where I'm located. Yep. Early Christian stones. Now then, a bit further down the coast, we're not actually on the coast, we're about 10 miles from the sea, but down the coast, down the west coast of Wales, we'll look at the map later, is a village called Llanfair. Now this word, Llan, which I'll write on the board, Llan means the church, it means the Christian community that was founded by a particular saint. By now it means the church itself, but it was actually the community of believers that gathered around those early saints. Many people will know the story of Saint Sergei of Radonej in the Russian church, how he went into the forest, people gathered around him, and then he left, went deeper into the forest, and this way he opened up the forests. These saints did a similar thing. They founded Christian communities, monastic communities, that then became larger communities, then bearing the name of the saint who founded them. So, for example, let's say near the town I live is a place called Llandecwyn. Okay. So there's a saint called Tecwyn, and in his church there's a stone also commemorating his burial in the 6th century. The stone is there. It's a 19th century church, but in the wall is this 6th century stone commemorating the burial of the priest Tecwyn, who is Saint Tecwyn, and the church is named after him. And if you look at a map of Wales, you can go through every region of Wales and see these dozens, hundreds of names of saints with Llan before them. In fact, most places in Wales are Llan something or other. The church, the community founded by these saints, and I've written in an article, I've done an interview in which I say Wales is actually the sum total of the places founded by these saints, a nation created by saints. I'm not going to speak only about Wales, but I'm just putting myself in context. Now that particular picture, if we go back to the previous one, in Llanfair is the Church of Mary, because in the Middle Ages some changes were made and some early dedications were replaced by more well-known dedications. There were quite a few dedications to St. Peter, to the Archangel Michael, to the Mother of God. And this particular depiction is a representation of a very interesting phenomenon. And it is a place in Llanfair, the village known by the name of the Mother of God, called All Troed Mair, the imprint of the foot of the Mother of God. And there was a tradition that she had visited, in a vision presumably, that she had visited that part of Wales at some time. And the stone can be seen. Nobody knows about it. Nobody goes there. But the farmer there is a very kind, gentle person, very happy to show you. And I went there in fact, about 2 weeks ago just to see it once again. And this is something that was produced at some stage or other by someone. based on that footprint. It is the exact shape of a footprint in the rock. I can't tell you any more than that, but I can tell you that the tradition existed. So we're talking about a country in which once these traditions were very much alive. And it's very similar. This is actually, I think, based on the similar footprint in Spain somewhere, and there's another one in Pochaev Lavra in Ukraine as well. So this is a phenomenon that exists in at least 2 other places, but it's just a few miles down the road from where I live. And Ethiopia also now. Thank you. Okay, there are 2 examples of the Llan. Llan Gabi, 2.5 miles, Llan Armon, and then Saint Gabi as well. So it shows you very clearly the name of the saint attached to Llan Church. Okay, this is the similar thing from Spain, footprint of the Mother of God. Right. Okay, let me take you now, say an hour's drive away from where I am, and it's southeast now from Blaenau Ffestiniog, and to the Church of Saint Melangell, Melangell. There are some pictures of her there. This saint was an Irish princess. She lived in the 6th century and fled from an arranged marriage in Ireland and travelled over very remote mountains in Wales and found a secluded valley where she felt she would be safe from this arranged marriage. And she settled there and she lived there as a hermitess. Some time later, one day, who came into that valley but Brochwel a Scuthrog?
Sounds bad.
Not a well-known person, perhaps, in Kansas. Not a well-known person in Wales, actually.
Father, would you say that one more time?
Brochwel a Scuthrog.
Thank you.
You can use it to frighten people. It sounds like a swear word, but it isn't. So you can use it to frighten on people. Brochwel a Scuthrog was the king of Powys, and he was hunting with his companions, and they were chasing a hare, and the hare fled and hid under the skirt of this woman. The hounds immediately froze and began to howl. The bugler's bugle froze to his lips. The whole scene froze. The prince realized that there was something extraordinary happening. He saw the maiden and realized it was a miracle and that she was a saint. And he gave the valley to her in perpetuity. And this valley was in danger of being drowned for a water scheme to supply water some years ago, and it didn't happen because he promised it to her in perpetuity.
Amen.
And she became a hermit, and she gathered around her a group of disciples, and she was buried, and her church became a shrine, a place of pilgrimage. During the reign of King Henry VIII, that one who had the 6 wives, he and who broke away the church in Britain from the church in Rome and became the head of the church. As you probably know, he had a right-hand man, a henchman called Thomas Cromwell, whose job it was to go around and destroy the vestiges of Catholicism. And shrines were broken, the altars were smashed. Not one altar from that time remains in the UK. Every single one was destroyed, not one remains. The shrines of saints were destroyed, the images, icons were all destroyed. When Anglicans, with whom we have a very good relationship, they're very friendly actually and very warmly disposed to us, to be honest. But when they say that they're the continuation of the church before the Reformation, I feel like recounting some of these facts. I mean, if we went to an Orthodox country, we went to Greece or Romania or Russia or Ukraine and told them, right, what would you think of someone who came in, burnt all the relics, destroyed the forms of services we were accustomed to, forced the monks and nuns to leave the monasteries and get married, destroyed every vestige of our tradition, would you consider that to be still the Orthodox Church? Well, the answer is no, of course. So her relics were removed from the shrine at the Reformation, and the stone shrine was dismembered and demolished, but local farmers put the stones in the walls of their farms. And Canon Donald Alchin, who writes a lot about Welsh spirituality from a very sympathetic point of view, and is a very great friend of the Orthodox Church, he thinks that this was done deliberately, that they were actually protecting these bits of stone. And so, when this church was restored, I remember this church 30 years ago, when it was an abandoned church in danger of demolition. And when it was restored, starting about 15 years ago, they were able to retrieve many of the stones and to reconstruct the shrine. And although not all the stones were preserved, many were. So they certainly had sufficient of them to be able to know what the shape of it was. And they replaced the other bits deliberately with concrete so that you could tell which are the original bits and which are the replacement bits. And this happened when a very, very learned and gentle Anglican priest was put in charge of that parish, or the parish in which that church is located, and the bishop wanted him to demolish it to within a metre of the ground and just show where the church had been. But he was determined to restore it, and he and his wife restored it, and the final payment for all the restoration happened the day before he died. She then was one of the Anglican ladies who's been ordained, and she then became the vicar. And she continued the work, to be honest, and she's doing the same work in the last parish in Wales, in a place called Daron, which I'll take you to digitally on Thursday, hopefully. Anyway, if we can go back perhaps to the St. Melaniath. They restored the church, they found the relics in the place that was a tomb and was known to be the place where they'd been buried, and they replaced the relics in the newly rebuilt reliquary, and people are going there again. It's a very remote place to which, for example, a bus can't go because the roads are so narrow. They get about 18,000 pilgrims a year there, and many miracles have taken place there. And that really is a sign of hope, I would say. And that's about 20 miles down the road from where I'm based. Yes, Father. 30 or so miles further east is this Celtic cross, famous Whitford cross, with very intricate decorations, a very fine and typical example of the many Celtic crosses that can be found with almost identical patterns in England, Wales, Scotland, Isle of Man, and Cornwall, those Celtic lands. This is one of them. So this is just the sort of geographical context. We take these things for granted. We live amongst all these holy things, amongst all these historical things. Most people are not even aware of them. Right, okay, we'll go on now to St. Cadwaladr. I don't think so, no. Do you think we did? Right, okay. In the meantime, while we're waiting to get the right sequence of pictures, His Grace would like me to speak briefly about this. This is a reconstruction of a famous cross that was the chief relic of Wales. Within was a portion of the true cross. This was the national relic. It was lost to Wales at the death of our last prince in 1282, and it's said to be in St. George's Chapel in Windsor outside London. But the actual cross itself, this is reconstructed from descriptions that existed. But the relic, we think, is in St. George's Chapel, which is the private chapel of the Queen of the UK. So this was the most sacred object in Wales until that period. Okay, so we have a mission. And the mission is specifically to call people back to their Christian roots. And missions need patron saints. And the story how St. Cadwallader became our patron saint is as follows. I've been very interested, even before I became Orthodox, in finding out more about these saints. And one of the tragedies of the Reformation was that the depictions of the saints had been destroyed. Any statues, any images had just been burnt and demolished. Many of them, some of them were burnt with the martyrs in Tyburn in London. If you go to Marble Arch in London, there's a sort of traffic island there. That's Tyburn. That's where they martyred many Catholic priests and monks and nuns. We know the names of the ones who were martyred there. Also relics were martyred there, were burnt. For example, the horse of one of the saints, Dervel Garan. He was depicted as a knight on a horse, and the statue of the saint was burnt there with the martyrs. If you go there in London sometime, you can find an inscription on a brass plaque on that place saying this is the place of where Tyburn was. Anyway, very few depictions have survived, but some have, because Cromwell didn't actually destroy the images of monarchs. And so if there were any saints who happened to be a king or a queen, he didn't destroy their images. And this is how we have a few surviving depictions of early saints. And the first one that I ever came across, and this was many years ago, in fact when I was still in school, I was given a book of ancient artifacts of Wales, and I saw a picture of Saint Cadwallader. He was a 7th century saint. He was the son of a warrior and the grandson of a very great saint, Saint Cadvan, who gave lands to build monasteries and who was a very deeply pious and Christian king. Saint Cadwallader's father, Cadwallon, was a warrior, and Saint Cadwallader himself was of a very different disposition. He was a very peaceful, mild character, and even the icon shows him wearing the crown somewhat reluctantly and uncomfortably. He lived at the time when there were all kinds of invasions and there was a plague. And what he did was to give away all that he had to the impoverished and diseased people. And he's just known for his Christian, meek, gentle, generous spirit. And once I found this depiction, I thought we must get an icon painted based on this. If we can find any depictions that have survived, we need to use them as bases for icons. And I started the process and tried to find an icon painter, and I found one who painted, I told him the life of the saint, and I showed him a picture of the stained glass window which remains. It's on the church on an island called Anglesey. It was actually downstairs in the chapel where we had Vespers this evening. Of the half a dozen or so icons on the wall, it was the one that was not very bright. It was a stained glass window. You can see it next time you're there. And it's a 14th century depiction of the saint that survived. And I told the icon painter about the life of the saint, handed him the picture, and asked him to base his icon on it. Eventually the icon arrived, a very beautifully painted icon of Saint Vladimir holding a Celtic cross. So I thought, right, Saint Vladimir holding a Celtic cross. So some people who were in the parish said, oh, we know another icon painter who will certainly get this right. And he lives abroad somewhere, I won't say where. It wasn't the States. And so he came over to get the feel of Wales. So he came over and he went away, and 3 years later the icon arrived. It was a big icon like this, magnificent piece of art. And I had a nun from Mount Sinai visiting at the time, and we unpacked the icon and we looked at the icon and we looked at each other. And she said, what does it remind you of? I said, I don't like to tell you really. She said, what does it remind you of? I don't like to tell you. Anyway, it was the King of Spades.
That's showing.
I gave it to a short-sighted priest. And I contacted an old friend, a Cypriot iconographer, very humble man. I said, would you like to try it? And he had the right spirit, and I left it there. And it was there for quite a long time, and he lives in London, I was going to London. I said, how's the icon getting on? Well, he said, I'm having trouble with the face. Come to see me, tell me more about the saint. So the next day I went to see him, walked into the room, and this icon was ready. I said, I thought you hadn't finished it. He said, a very strange thing happened. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, my wife made me a cup of coffee, and I started painting, and I couldn't stop. And when I was making mistakes, the brush seemed to correct itself. And I've never had this experience. I've been painting icons for 40 years. This is how I earn my living. This is how I brought up my family. And in fact, I can't take any money for this work, he said. I've never had an experience like it, he said. I even made a mistake. I don't think it shows on this photo. But he pointed out the mistake which he'd made. And, it was here actually, and he'd drawn a line from there to there, instead of from there to there. And in the original, you can, and in fact you can even here, just about see it, where he'd made the mistake and the brush had corrected itself. And you may be able to see it on this. I don't know, I haven't checked. Well, there is some faint thing there. Yes, there is something. No. But anyway, we'll take him at his word. And so we were very happy with this icon, and it was the first icon painted for our church of any indigenous saint. The saint himself, well, where do I stop? There are stories also. We installed this icon in the church on the eve of Christmas, and after the liturgy on Christmas Day, we'd had one or two visitors to the church, and one of them said, you know that icon, he said, something very strange happened to me by that icon. I said, what happened to you? He said, well, I'm a very down-to-earth man, he said, as you know. I was a soldier in the army for many years, and I felt that the carpet was undulating like the sea in front of me, he said. Oh, I said, how strange. And then some other young man said, oh, my mother was here last night, and she felt someone tap her on the shoulder, and there was no one behind her, she was standing in the back. I said, that'll teach her to go to fortune tellers. And someone was doing work on the house, replacing the roof, and I said, oh, you've done a very fine job, you obviously enjoy your work. He said, oh, no, I can't bear my work, I can't wait to retire, he said. But it's been different this time. I said, why? Oh, he said, I think that saint has helped me, he said. Out of the blue. He knew nothing about him. So then the person who'd felt that the carpet was like an undulating sea in front of him, he said, I want to give you a gift, he said. I said, well, thank you very much. And he brought a gift. Byzantine coins. One with an icon of the Lord Jesus Christ on the coin. I said, how amazing, where have these come from? He said, I go sometimes with a metal detector, and I found them. I said, where? He said, I found them in the village of Llanrothen. I said, how interesting, I used to live there. Well, where in Llanrothen did you find them? You know that hill that goes up to Croesthor? I said, yes, I know that hill. He said, oh, do you know that building on the left? Yes, I said, well, just opposite there. Oh, I said, how strange, that's where I lived. And that's where I had the first chapel dedicated to Saint Cadwallader. I thought you might like to hear these stories. Now, the history of Wales begins with a book, is written in a book called The Chronicles of the Princes, Bryn Tywysogion. And it begins like this. In I think the year 636, Cadwallader, the last king of the Britons, died. And that is the year, it says, that the Britons lost dominion over Britain. It was the time of the Saxon and Anglo-Saxon invasions. St Cadwaladr was the last Roman or British king, and the history of Wales begins with his death. And so I thought, well, the history of our nation begins with a saint. And so he's an appropriate saint to be the patron saint of Wales Orthodox Mission. So he's our patron saint. There's our stamp. If you get a letter from me, that'll be stamped on the back. And actually the church in the back there, on the wall, the second from the right here, second, is the Church of St Cadwaladr, named after the saint. That's where the stained glass window is. And to the left is an inscription in stone saying, Catamanos Rex Sapientissimus, his grandfather, Cadman, the most wise king. This is, I think, a 6th century stone in Llangadwaladr. So that's that church, that inscription, the saint, our mission. Okay. St David is the patron saint of Wales. This is another icon by Gregory Papageorgiou. And we'll come back at the end of this session, if there's time then, because there are other things I'd like to speak about in the meantime. But this is St David, patron saint of Wales. And here we are from medieval manuscript, Dewi, pedigrees of the saints. Welsh people are very preoccupied with ancestry, and if Welsh people meet each other, they usually ask, where are you from? And it's not until I went to university in London that I learned that not everybody everywhere in the world asked this question. But I'd meet another fellow student and say, oh, where are you from? And people don't ask this apparently, but we always do in Wales. And because Wales is such a small country, the chances are that you'll know somebody from the same place. So the pedigrees, if we go back to that one, the pedigrees of the saints reflect this, or perhaps our contemporary interest reflects this awareness of our spiritual ancestry, which these pedigrees obviously are connected to. Taken from an old manuscript written in the 13th century, a long time after the saint died, of course. But Dewi, David, was the son of Sander, the son of Ceredig, the son of Cynnedd Wledig. I'll talk about Cynnedd Wledig tomorrow. His mother was the daughter of Gunnar of Caergawch in Menivia. And then it mentions other members of the family of Cynnedd Wledig, a very important ruler. Dogamail was the son of Ithal, the son of Ceredig, the son of Cynnedd Wledig. And so it goes on. That's just one page of these pedigrees of the saints. The next icon is an embroidered icon of St. David, which we have. That's his cathedral. St. David's Cathedral in St. David's in South Wales, medieval cathedral, but the shrine of the saint. It became a very important place. The ruins on the left are the ruins of the monastery and of the bishop's residence. It still is a cathedral, an Anglican cathedral, and there is a reliquary within it, which was given to the cathedral by the Patriarch of Romania, and within which are some relics. Some think they are the relics of St. David that have survived the Reformation. The dean of the cathedral, who's a good historian, doesn't. They've been carbon dated, but I don't know whether they are or not, but certainly the reliquary is there, and certainly his relics were there. This is the reliquary.
Father,
Yes.
how do you say Saint David in Welsh?
In the Welsh, Dewi. Dewi. D-E-W-I. D-E-W-I. Dewi. Dewi Sant. Right. Yes, if you could rotate that, Father, that'd be good. Well, one back will beat these. Yes, if you could get that. It's quite interesting because it, yes, it illustrates a point. There we are. The second part, the name of Saint, Kyrig, Kyriakos. And the first part means his resting place, the place where he sat. And there are lots of places in Wales named like this, the seat of so-and-so, where the saint used to sit in meditation. And this is one of them, Eisteddfod Gyrig. So really I've included this just to tell you about the sacred geography of where I live. That all over the place, places named up. The tragic thing is that, for example, Welsh children in schools don't know what this means, don't know the significance of it. So it's not just the Llan, this, that and the other, it's a Eisteddfa so-and-so or something else. Various things named after these saints. So at least the saints are alive to us, and we're encountering their names all the time. And perhaps this can be used in future. Okay, now to put me within the context of contemporary orthodoxy. I first encountered the Orthodox Church when I was 17 years old and attended the Christmas liturgy at the Serbian Orthodox Church in Birmingham. Bishop Basil has been there and knows the priest who was there then and is there now, Father Milenko Zebic. And that really, already I had some interest, and that engendered a further interest, and that's how I decided to find out where I could study church history in Britain. And that led me to London University at a time when Philip Sherrard was there, and I don't know if he's a popular writer in the States, but he's a well-known Orthodox theologian, and he was my tutor in London, and I did some research under him, and he was a wonderful teacher to have, and had his influence on me, of course. So I encountered Orthodoxy, wanted to look deeper into it, and found myself living within reach of Russian, Greek, Romanian churches. Had as a fellow student a Romanian theological student, very rare in those days, late 60s and early 70s, to have an Eastern European studying abroad, especially studying theology. So we also became good friends. I saw him about 5 years ago, after a long gap, 25 years perhaps, and he's now Archbishop of Târgoviște in Romania, Archbishop Nifon. So he was a good friend. And at that time, in London, was Metropolitan Anthony of Suraj, who I suppose is a well-known name to you. And I'll tell you more about him when the photo comes up. But in the meantime, I have to tell you about Father Barnabas, who was the first Welsh Orthodox priest since the Great Schism. Here he is, died, I think, 6 years ago now. And we were good friends. He tonsured me Razafor monk, and we spent many years working together. I drove a car, he didn't, so we would go to each other's appointments, and I would take him around as he went around giving talks and preaching, very good preacher. He did some work on the media too, interviews and so on. He was well versed in the sacred history of Wales, knew a lot about its saints, a lot about its holy places. He introduced me to a lot of those places. So may his memory be eternal, Archimandrite Barnabas, a well-known person in Wales, first Welsh Orthodox priests since 1054.
My God.
This is the Holy Well of St. Non, the mother of St. David. It doesn't follow on in strict sequence. Text of the life of St. David, I think. Next one. This is the site of Strata Florida Abbey, where the book, The Chronicles of the Princes, was written. And this was the Westminster Abbey of Wales. It was where the princes and poets were buried. It was destroyed at the Reformation, at the Protestant Reformation, with all the other monastic houses. It was one of the most important monasteries in Wales. Wonderful place, lovely area, right in the centre, dead centre of Wales. Next picture. Text of the life of St. David, I think. Here we are, Metropolitan Anthony, with a young Hiero monk whose grandparents once lived in Kansas, apparently. Have you seen a picture of Metropolitan Anthony before? Or is he, but he's well known in the States. His books are known here. Shall I tell you a bit more about him? as I was privileged to know him. He was the son of the Tsarist Russian ambassador to Iran, to Persia, as it was then. He was born in Persia, and very soon the revolution came, 1917 revolution, during which, of course, his father lost his job, and like many thousands of others, they emigrated to France, and specifically to Paris, because there was a strong cultural link between the Russian aristocracy in particular and France. And he lived there. There were many, many thousands of Russians living in Paris. He was brought up there in a not particularly religious family, I think. And in fact, by the time he was a teenager, he was a convinced atheist. Am I perhaps repeating stuff that you all know anyway? No, okay. It's worth knowing this. So that was it. They were quite poor, I think, because when he went to university, he had to teach Latin in the evening to pupils to get money to pay to do his medical course. He was a doctor. One day, a friend of his said, please come to the Russian Youth Club this evening. He said, yes, I usually come. What's on this evening? Oh, I've invited a priest to come and speak. And Anthony said, I'm sorry, you're asking the wrong person. I'm not going to waste an evening coming to listen to a priest speak. And they said, oh, please come. Why are you so keen for me to come? Well, because hardly anybody else is coming either. I'll ask somebody else. Oh no, I've already asked other people. He said, I don't want to listen to this man. He said, well, just come along, he said. You don't even have to listen. Come along, sit at the back, and I owe you a favor, right? Okay, he said, but remember you owe me a favor. So he went and he listened to the priest. And at the end, he said, this was very unlike what I'd expected. I'd gone there with very deep-rooted prejudices, with a caricature of what a priest is and what a priest would have to say. I expected nothing but a boring old man going on and on and on about things that were of no interest at all. But he said, I have to tell you that that was not what I experienced. What I experienced, he said, was 100 times worse than what I had anticipated. I cannot believe that it exceeded my expectations in boredom and in worthless babble, he said. There's nothing left to do, he said, but to find out whether this man's depiction of Christianity is anywhere near the truth. So he went home and went to his father's library and found a gospel. And he checked Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Mark is the shortest. And so he started to read through the gospel of St. Mark to find out whether the person of Jesus Christ was anything resembling this portrayal. And before he got to the end of reading that gospel, he says, Christ was present in the room at my desk. And from that moment onwards, he had no choice. He was a believer. And there was a radicalism to his theology, to his ministry, perhaps even to his episcopate, but certainly to his thinking. And he had a dislike for anything that was clutter, anything that was superfluous. He had a dislike of clericalism. I remember when he first invited me, I was a young monk at the time, and he asked me to help him with his youth camps. He was a man in his 60s at the time, and there I was. I must have wanted to find out, what sort of creature is this monk really? And he gave me the job of digging the latrines. I think that was my test. I think I wouldn't be a priest now if I hadn't done that job properly. And that's the sort of man he was. Well, he'd been brought up very unusually. I remember he told me many times the story of he'd been climbing on the roof of a shed in the garden, and his father said to him, "Come down from that shed now." And he said, "Oh, why?" he said. "Are you afraid I'm going to fall down and break my neck and die?" And his father said, "The question is not whether you live or whether you die. The question is what you live for and what you die for." So if you're brought up like that, I suppose you're going to be a fairly radical... and he was. And Metropolitan Anthony, and whatever anybody else says, it's not true. Metropolitan Anthony is the person who opened the door of orthodoxy to people who were not Greeks or Russians or Romanians or people from the usual ethnic groups that are Orthodox. He's the man who did it, you know. Others may have added to his work, and people certainly like Nicholas Zernov backed up his work and wrote books that made Orthodoxy accessible. But he is the man who opened the door. He's the man who resisted the pressures in that Russian parish not to have any English, for example. He's the man who took the plunge and faced the opposition. He's the man who went round the whole of Britain for 20, 25 years, giving talks and lectures on Orthodox spirituality. He's the man that did one broadcast after the other on the radio, on the TV, meditations at Christmas, meditations on icons. Everybody knew his name in those days. And he was, of course, Russian, thoroughly Russian. And although had never lived in Russia, and at a certain point, in fact, I think he'd been challenged with the possibility of becoming so anglicized and losing his Russian accent, and he didn't do that. He didn't want to do that because it wasn't necessary for him to do that. He was Russian, but he had this courage, and many of us who are Orthodox now and Orthodox priests, we owe everything to him in a sense. And later on, other churches began to open their doors, and now there are some clergy and laity who join the Orthodox Church through the Greek diocese and so on. But at that time, nobody did. In the 60s, I remember only one English priest in the Greek Archdiocese, and Metropolitan Anthony was the man who did it. Some joined the Russian Church in exile, but he was the man who had this vision. And let's hope and pray that his vision is perpetuated. He died just over a year ago. I was honoured to be one of the 2 priests that celebrated his funeral liturgy, and then one of 40 priests present at the funeral service itself. Metropolitan Anthony of Suraj. He had many anecdotes. He had the additional problem of establishing the Russian Patriarchal Church in Britain at a time when there was the wall between East and West. The Iron Curtain was firmly in place in those days, and he needed some courage, really, and he used to go to Russia. His predecessor, Metropolitan Nikolai in Paris, never accepted an invitation to Russia. He was afraid to go. Metropolitan Nikolai is the one who ordained Father Barnabas, the priest I showed you before. Metropolitan Anthony used to go, and he got into trouble when he supported Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example. And he used to tell this story that he was invited to the room of some official who told him, Metropolitan Anthony, I have bad news for you. Your passport has been lost. Oh, he said. And what has to be done for it to be found? And and they said, well, tone things down a bit. You speak very explicitly. Just tone things down a bit. So he said, he said, I've never lived in Russia. I've always wanted to live in Russia. If my passport is not found, you are making my dream come true. Oh, you're impossible. Here's your passport. So there's the man standing outside my house with that young hieromonk who had grandparents from Texas, and the nun from Egypt, who spotted the king of spades. Okay, on with, no, this is a Celtic cross. We were trying to incorporate both Orthodox and Celtic traditions. So we've got the sort of 8-pointed cross incorporated into a Celtic cross. I'm not sure if it works, I don't know, really. But, and the inscription around is, we venerate thy cross, O Lord, and we glorify thy holy resurrection. So I don't know. I'd be very glad of comments on whether that is something suitable or effective. An icon of a Celtic saint, Saint Pablo, whose image survives from the Middle Ages because Cromwell didn't smash it because he was a king. And on the virtual pilgrimage, the first of the two, I'll take you to his church, to where the stone is. But this depiction is based on a tombstone effigy, tombstone inscription, and the icon is very closely based on that. These are tombs on the pilgrim route to St. David's, where St. David was buried. I think these now are not in any particular order, but are just a cross-section of images. This is the area around St. David's. It's on the coast of Pembrokeshire. Sorry? Well, two saints that will figure prominently in future talks. That island is we're back to inscribed stones. That island's off the north coast of Wales, and the two smaller islands, one's at the northwest and the other's at the southeast. And these two saints used to walk from their islands and meet in the centre, the spiritual converse. I will take you on this pilgrimage on Wednesday. And however, the saint on the left, who's known as Saint Cubby, and his island is on the left. There's a big town there called Holyhead in Welsh Caergybi. That's where you catch the boat for Ireland from. And the other island on the right is St. Ceiriol's Island. That's an abandoned island. And of course, when St. Cubby left in the morning, he was facing east. He was facing the sun as it rose, and when he went back in the evening, he was facing the sun as it set. And his face became darkened, so he became known as St. Cubby the Yellow-Faced, and St. Ceiriol, because he had his back to the sun in the morning and the evening, became known as St. Ceiriol the White-Faced. Well, presumably they didn't make this journey every day, or they would have done nothing else at all in their lives, and they may as well both have settled in the centre. So it can't be literally true, but it shows how they tradition these. They're called. If you refer to one, you say the yellow-faced. If you refer to the other, you say the white-faced. So the tradition, these epithets embody this tradition of these two saints coming together for spiritual converse. And so they embody a very important, of course, Orthodox concept of the communion of saints and of the need for spiritual revelation of thoughts and spiritual guidance and so on. But people wouldn't realize that. They think it was just about the sun, you know. So we have to look under the surface and enable people to perhaps come to an awareness of traditions which they are vaguely aware of but don't know the significance of. And more of these Celtic stones, Christian Celtic stones. St. Non's Well, mother of St. David. Yes, the miracle of the tree growing upside down. The miracle of the tree moving upwards. And again. It's our local holy well, a mile from my house. Not the water's a stream, the well is in that building. And the building is in a state of decay. And the old woman who owns it goes on and on about its condition, but won't do anything about it. I've offered to buy it, for the Orthodox Church to buy it and to do it up, but she's afraid that we'd bottle the water and become millionaires. Oh, well, no, this is amazing. I showed you the footprint of the Virgin Mary. This is the footprint of the horse of Saint Engan, who was a king and whose shrine was in the West Peninsula of North Wales. And this is the stone that his horse's hoof struck as he flew up into the sky with the saint on his back. And you can see the footprint of the horse, and people used to take water from this footprint to assuage their thirst. Nobody knows of this stone, hardly anyone. Gone out of people's memory. There it is, all Troed March Engan, the imprint of the footprint of St. Engan's horse. Well, it's part of our sacred topography. Here's the icon of All Saints of Britain. The original, I think, is in the Russian Cathedral in London. I think it's painted by the wife of one of the priests there, Patsy Fosteropoulos. The poster which we've had made is larger than the original, and so you here in Kansas are the first ones to see the saints on this icon, on that size, on poster size. So it's a very fine icon, very beautifully painted, of a selection of the saints of the British Isles. I should have thought of getting copies to bring you, and I didn't manage to do that, unfortunately. But I could easily find them for you, or give you an address where you can get them. Yeah. Well, that brings us to the end of. Oh no, it's not the end of the slideshow. Here we are. This is the view from my office. And those mountains are man-made. Every stone has been moved by hand because it's a slate quarrying town, and in the slate industry, which was the main industry of North Wales, and it took various forms. In some places it was open above ground level, but in our town it was deep down beneath the ground, going down even to sea level from about 2,000 feet down to sea level. And for every ton of slate quarried, 9 tons would be waste material. And here's the waste material. Every single one of those stones has been carried by man's hand. And they surround the whole town. The town's at the end of the valley, and these are the tips surround it. That's right, good. And that straight line coming down, there would have been a railway track on that, carrying the stones down to the main station, and there are approximately 30 of those abandoned inclines, they're called. You can imagine when the place was at the height of its prosperity, or the height of its activity. It was never prosperous. The height of its activity, these trains coming up and down, carrying tons of slate day in, day out. This is a medieval castle, Harlech Castle, and behind, on the right, is the mountain, at the foot of which the other side is the town, Blaenau where I live. And there's an aerial view of our town. And the Orthodox Church is slightly to the right of this photograph. And this is my patron saint, Saint Daniel, D-E-I-N-I-O-L, which is the Welsh equivalent of Daniel, the Bishop of Bangor in Arfon. It is said that he was the diocese he founded was the first diocese in Britain. That other bishops before him, that the territorial system hadn't developed, whereby a bishop actually had territorial jurisdiction. And the king of the time, Mael Gwynedd, of whom I'll tell you tomorrow, he appointed Daniel to be bishop of the precise area that was his kingdom. And so Saint Daniel is said to be the first diocesan bishop in Britain. Here's a map of Wales, and perhaps I could just point out where we are.
Here, Father, come here. Come here.
Okay.
So it's...
Yes, that's where we are. That's Blaenau Festiniog. And if you go to that island, Father, in the top left-hand corner, that's where I'm going to take you on Wednesday, around that island, and to the left, the small island on the left tip. There we are, that's Holyhead, St Cubby's Island, and now go to the southeast of that big island, and there's another very small island, southeast tip. That's right, very small island, southeast. You can just a blue spot really, off the very tip. Yes. The bottom right, just above the word Conwyn. Small island. So those are the islands of the saints.
Where's Holywell?
Holywell is to your right. See a hill right on the top, on the coast there. Not on the island itself, but on the mainland now. Go back to the mainland. Travel right towards England. Colwyn Bay Rill, you can see. The next place up further. Rill. It's between Rill and Prestatys. It's just there. Holywell is there. Yeah. South is St Asaph, head of the diocese. Oh, this is the view looking over to Anglesey, that island, and it's the Church of St Edwin. I was actually from that village originally. We've come the full round. And if I can just say one other thing with reference to tomorrow, what I'd like to invite you to do is to travel with me a little bit through the history of Britain, a little bit through the geography of Britain, so that we can find the context for the history of Christianity, the historical context and the geographical context. I'll accompany you along paths that are the most familiar to me, but I think that will enable you to pursue any other paths that are of specific interest to you in the future. So my response to your kind invitation is to invite you to travel with me as fellow travellers, fellow pilgrims, through the history of Britain, the early history, through the geography, so as to find where the saints fit in the hope that this will be of interest to you in the future. Thanks very much.
I have one question. The majority faith of your town would be what traditionally?
The town itself, you see, most places in Wales have been sanctified by the labours of these saints. But our town is a very new town, going back only, say, 150 years. It came into existence because of the slate mining industry. I always tell people that these saints claimed the very land for Christ. This is what they did. They laid a claim to it. But nobody ever laid a claim to that particular place. And not until the Calvinists turned up and claimed it. But their claim hasn't been very effective in some ways. When the population of the town was at its height, which was about 12,000, it's down to 4,000 now. When it was 12,000, there were 45 Christian places of worship there. Anglican, and then Wesleyan Methodist, Calvinistic Methodist, Congregationalist, Baptist, Scotch Baptist, which exists only in Wales, not in Scotland. Catholic, later the Catholics and Orthodox have turned up. So the people have been brought up, or the previous generations have been brought up in these chapels. Now, the leaders, the elders in the chapels, were always the stewards in the slate mines, in other words, the high-ranking officials. So you would perhaps change denomination to be in the same chapel as your steward in the hope of being treated well at work. So it was all connected to the socio-economic status of the town as well. These chapels are empty. More than half of them have closed. One's a petrol station, for example. In South Wales you can find chapels that are whatever, nightclubs, petrol stations, bingo halls, anything. Half of them, I would say, have closed in our town. The other half have congregations, very few people, 4 or 5 perhaps, going to them. So they're dead, and they realize they're dead. And the leaders of these denominations realize that the denominations are dead. But that isn't to say that they're seething and eager to find something to replace that, because I think that the feeling that is left behind is a sense of relief, because those chapels had such a negative form of Christianity. They were, first of all, the theology itself. Calvinism is a very frightening dogma. The idea that God can create someone with the sole purpose of tormenting them for eternity is very difficult to reconcile with the idea that God is love. And in Scotland, Calvinism prevailed, but in Wales, double Calvinism. Predestination not only to heaven, but predestination to hell as well. And that means that God created people with the sole purpose of tormenting them eternally, which neither Stalin nor Genghis Khan did, in all fairness to them. And this is the, and that then was I don't know to what, how deeply to go into this, but okay, let's say you live in a Calvinistic community. How do you know if you're the elect or not? Oh, well, the answer to that is by your fruit you shall know them. So the pious person, the person who seemed to be good, must be destined for heaven. So it's very important to be seen to be good. And then appearances take over. Everything becomes a matter of appearance. Hypocrisy sets in. It's not so much what you do, but what you're seen to do. And that prevailed. And so there was that. And there was then the very censorious and judgmental side of it, whereby, for example, single mothers were publicly excommunicated. They were taken to church and they were put on trial publicly by the clergy and by the elders in the church. I know many, many stories. I know someone very, very close to our family to whom this happened, ostracized because of being a single mother. But I know many others. I knew women 30, 40 years ago who never went out of the house. They were kept by their families. They were in their 60s and 70s, and only their family knew that they existed. They never went out shopping, for example. They were usually in a back room, and if you knew the family well, they would appear. And I remember my solicitor, my lawyer, saying to me, "Oh, this was terrible," he said. He's a Calvinist himself. And he said, "I know 3 such women in such and such a village down the road," he said. And they still went to church in their 80s, and they still sat in the back seats. They'd been single mothers in their youth. They still sat in the back seat, and when it came time for Holy Communion, they used to leave the chapel, he said. And he said, he added, and he said, the chapel should have forgiven them and given them full membership. I said, the chapel should have gone down on bended knee and asked their forgiveness for humiliating and ostracizing them and spiritually abusing them for the last 60 years of their life. That's what the chapel should have done. So there's this legacy. I often feel that if I was in Tibet, where people knew nothing at all about Christianity, it would be easier than being in a place where people think they know what Christianity is, but what they think it is this. And that is the difficulty. And just saying that God loves them isn't enough, because they've heard that. The same people who were telling them that God had created people to torment them were saying that. And so the challenge is how to really tell people that God loves them.
We sort of face the same thing here, Father. We have very much in common, but we don't have the number of saints that you have to help melt some hearts in Wales. Are there any other questions that could be asked rather quickly? Father Daniel Griffith is also a Welshman, right?
We met in 71.
Yes, 71 was it? Yes.
In September of 71.
You were visiting Father Barnabas, yes.
I
certainly remember your name, even before that. I think it don't know who told me. Somebody, some priest. That told me. Yes.
Anyway, my question is regarding relic for Saint Daniel. His relics.
This is, yes, Father Daniel asked the question whether the relics of Saint Daniel exist. Interestingly enough, it is thought that Saint Daniel is buried on Basil Island. Basil Island is the island at the very tip of that peninsula, which I showed you on the map and which will form virtual pilgrimage to the journey to the tip of that peninsula. It is thought that he's buried there, and the reason they think this is that the Bangor Cathedral has never had a place which has identified in the cathedral as being the shrine of St. Daniel. And in the Middle Ages, if his body had been there, it would have been a shrine church, but it never was, and that's why it was always a poor cathedral, apparently. So we think most likely that he's one of the 20,000 saints buried on that island.
We have Compline at what, 9:30? What time is it, Father Daniel?
9:45.
Okay, in 10 minutes we have Compline. Father Daniel, thank you.
In South Wales, for a company called Brown Lennox that made chains. They said it had been made in a very similar way to the way that they make chains these days, by compressing the center of the links when they were still red hot. The purpose of the chain was identified as having been made to tie prisoners. Between each 20 or so links was a big link that would go around the prisoner's neck. The place where it was made is unknown. Also in that, near that lake were found parts of trumpets, cauldrons, and remnants of a war chariot. This war chariot has been reconstructed and is in the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. All these were of Celtic workmanship. So we know something about the ancient Celts. Now how about the study of the Celts? The names of the tribes are known only in their Latinized forms, which the classical authors gave them. And here are some of the names. Caledonia is part of Scotland. Picti, Damnoni, Votadini, Selgovai, Novantai, Brigantes, Parisi, Gangani, Ordovices, Silures, Deceangli, Demetai, Cornovi, Dubuni, Coritani, Iceni, Catovellauni, Trinovantes, Cantiagi, Atrebates, Belgai, Duhotries, and Dumnoni. This is a very diverse group of tribes. This long and crucial Celtic past has actually been much neglected, and Professor Norman Davis has written a very interesting history of the Isles of Britain and analyses why this should be the case. This is a very important period in the history of the Isles of Britain. Why has it been so neglected? And he says that there are several reasons. One is that students of Roman Britain always tended to read the Roman authors rather than go into the archaeology. They were people perhaps with a classical background, knew Greek and Latin, and derived their information from these writers. And students of Celtic times need, he says, to study archaeology. Actually, even archaeology is needed for the study of Roman Britain, let alone for the pre-Roman past, because the documents themselves are inadequate and belong to the period of the 6th century onwards. So he recommends that more archaeology be done. Furthermore, there's been in British academic life prejudice in favour of the classical. Educated Englishmen took more interest in ancient Greece than in ancient Britain. And ancient Britain was seen almost as an alien land. Thirdly, Celtic studies have tended to be studied in isolation and only by Celts. Whereas in truth, some historians realized that there was an imbalance, and they did try and highlight the significance of the Celts. And he mentioned some interesting writers that I'd like to just mention so that their names are familiar to us. The Breton from Brittany, what's now France, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote who lived between 1100 and 1155. In spite of much of his work being fanciful, he managed to get people to understand that before the Normans came to Britain, 1066, before the Normans were the Anglo-Saxons, and before the Anglo-Saxons the Romans, and before the Anglo-Saxons the Celts, and even to be aware of the sequence is something important. Then there was the great Welsh antiquarian Edward Llwyd, 1660 to 1709. He was a man from Oswestry on the border of Wales, became a fellow of Jesus College, Oxford, and the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum. He travelled widely in Ireland, Wales, and the Scottish Highlands and Brittany, collecting antiquities, manuscripts, folklore, and linguistic information. His Archaeologia Britannica, 1707, often is regarded as the very foundation of Celtic studies. He was a very remarkable man. He, for example, classifies the Celtic languages into the two groups of Q and P. Lloyd died young and in poverty, and the University of Oxford sold off his possessions to clear his debts. These included the sole original manuscript of the Book of Leinster and the sole original manuscript of the Yellow Book of Lecan. Both, thank God, are now safe in the library of Trinity College, Dublin. Most of his papers have remained unpublished. By the late 18th century to 19th century, government policies and ideas of enlightenment had triggered off a Celtic revival. There had been a Celtic reaction to negative attitudes towards the Celtic past of the Isles of Britain. One of these was the repression of the Jacobite risings in Scotland. The Jacobites were the family from which James I of England, who was James VI of Scotland, that was that family, and there were Jacobite risings in Scotland, and these were repressed. Continuing injustices of English rule in Ireland, which was, of course, treated in a colonial way in the very worst sense of that word. The official neglect of Welsh culture in Wales. It was, for example, by the 19th century, not allowed for Welsh children to speak Welsh in school, and they would be punished by having the Welsh knot attached to them. This was a plank of wood suspended by a rope around their necks, and whoever was wearing this last at the end of the day would be severely punished. And the person who would be wearing it last would be the person who had been reported last by a friend to have been heard speaking Welsh. So if you heard someone speak Welsh, you reported them in case you were found to be wearing the Welsh knot at the end of the day. Then there was the treason of the Blue Books. It was an official report into the state of education and social life in Wales, and this was a very treacherous report, which is still really the subject of great scandal, whereby the whole of the Welsh nation was maligned and insulted for their ignorance and immorality, supposed ignorance and supposed immorality, the treason of the Blue Books. So these policies, official British government policies in Scotland, Ireland and Wales, triggered off a negative reaction and triggered off an awareness amongst the Celtic people that they had a distinct identity and that they needed to embrace it and to claim it as their own. An interest began to be taken in Celtic poetry. An ode by Thomas Gray, the ode called The Bard, written in 1757, became a catalyst, and a huge debate ensued. Dr. Johnson, the English writer, and Boswell, his companion, who travelled with him to Scotland, denigrated the bards, and others then came quickly to their defence. Evan Evans, a Welshman, 1731 to 1789, defended Gray's ode, publishing his paraphrase of the 137th Psalm, alluding to the captivity of the Welsh bards by King Edward I, in order to highlight the similarity between the Babylonian captivity and the state of the Celts for many centuries. Then the harpist and antiquary Edward Jones, 1752 to 1824, published his collection of musical and poetical relics of the Welsh bards. However one assesses this embryonic revival, the fact is that by the 19th century, Celtic archaeology, Celtic languages and literature, all of which are worthy of academic study, had all found their place in British academic life, which was not the case before that. So by now there are many distinguished academic journals and innumerable distinguished university chairs in various places. For example, Welsh is taught in certainly one or two places in the States. I know that a friend of mine, Dr. Chris Groban, teaches Welsh in Texas, for example, in one of the universities. Visits Wales regularly every year, speaks Welsh fluently. Political developments also advanced the growth of Celtic studies, such as the creation of the Irish Free State and Gaelic being taught in I think, all schools. The belated adoption in the life of official policies protecting the country's Celtic cultures in the 1960s. There was in Wales, for example, a decade of great effort made, especially by young people and students, to get some official recognition of the Welsh language. It wasn't, for example, allowed for people to give testimony in court. I know a very sad, but at the same time amusing example of somebody who was in court, I don't know, for doing what, some minor offence, and he was addressed and asked, do you wish to be cross-questioned now or tomorrow? And the translator wasn't a very good translator and said to him in Welsh, wyt ti isio cael dy groeshoelio heddiw neu fory? And he made a mistake, he chose the wrong word, he wasn't a good translator. And he was meant to say, croesholly, interrogated, but he said, so he was meant to say, do you wish to be interrogated tomorrow? But he said, he used this word. This means to be crucified. Whoa! You wish to be crucified today or tomorrow? Well, it's anecdotal, but it just, shows, and certainly to this day, and I've visited courts many times, and certainly the people whose first language is Welsh won't always understand the very technical and specialised legal jargon that's used in these courts. But until about 20 years ago, Welsh had no official status whatsoever. It's incredible that one of the surviving languages of the original inhabitants of the Isles of Britain should have no official status in the country. Now it does. Of course, sadly, the Irish and Scottish languages are spoken by so few people now, unfortunately. The Highland clearances in Scotland are responsible for that, in Scotland certainly. Now we have fairly good government policies concerning Welsh, and in most places signs are in both languages, although when legislation was passed, business organisations were not obliged to do this, and that's a pity actually. But all official bodies, councils, town councils and county councils are obliged to have things in both languages. Then there was the establishment of the Centre of Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies in the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, and this is a very fine place with very high academic standards. But knowledge of and love for Celtic culture has not become part of British intellectual life, even to this day. And this past of British history is, in a sense, something that people are unaware of. For example, nobody in England would study a Celtic language in school. A Slovak comparative literature specialist recently asked about what exists in Britain in the sphere of comparative literature. He meant comparing the literature of the various languages of Britain. And the answer was none. Nobody was was working on comparative literature in Britain. Comparative literature means the comparison of the literature of the Isles. And in 1982, for example, Penguin published the Contemporary British Poetry, Book of Contemporary British Poetry. All poets writing in Celtic languages, even in translation, are excluded, but several non-British poets writing in English are included. So all Celtic writings in translation are not included, although it's the British book of poetry. And lots of people who are not from Britain but wrote in English are, as if to be British means to be English. So words have taken on a different meaning over the centuries. However, there has also been a popular Celtic explosion. Hundreds of CDs, Mel Gibson's film, Braveheart, Celtic folklore, primers of Celtic languages for amateurs, Celtic tourism, Celtic art, and Asterisk, definitely, and so-called Celtic spirituality. I have here some handouts, and one of them is about Celtic spirituality. Perhaps if we place them somewhere convenient for you to take with you at the end. Did you get the St. Cadwallader life yesterday? No. We'll have. Where did that get to, Father? We took it to the chapel, didn't we? Yes. I think it's the last, one of these. Well, this is one here, top right, Father, top right. Mix and pig Celts. Okay. Yes. This can be handed out at some stage. Be well. So-called Celtic spirituality. This is an article that appeared in the Tablet Catholic weekly journal, actually calling for a touch of realism, because people are very carried away by Celts. Celtic spirituality is very supposed to be very comparable to New Age things and so on. And this article is saying the Celts and their spirituality were very different from that. Whichever period you look at, whether the Celtic saints, who are very ascetic people, or whether you look at the forms of religion that Celts chose to adopt subsequently, such as Calvinism in Scotland and Wales, what you find is something very far removed from the fanciful idea that people have of Celtic spirituality. So it's a call to realism. Okay, shall we go on now to the Romans? I'm sorry to be a bit factual, but I think we do need this framework in order to make sense of what's to follow. Julius Caesar's expedition of 55 BC did not result in the conquest of Britain. According to Suetonius, his successor, Claudius, was driven into the campaign from which all other previous emperors had refrained by his vanity. Yes, we'll start now. No, the same one. Cicero had concluded on receiving a letter from his brother, who had accompanied Caesar, that Britain was no threat to the empire. It wasn't necessary to conquer Britain. Other emperors had refrained from doing so. But Strabo, the geographer, had said that the invasion would actually be unwise, and that the costs would exceed the revenues. So there were reasons not to conquer Britain. The invasion of 43 AD was commanded by a distinguished senator, Aulus Plautius. He headed 4 legions. That was about 50,000 men in all. 3 legions were taken from the imperial frontier on the Rhine, 1 from Pannonia. We even have the names of the legions. The 2nd Legion, Augusta, 14th Legion, Germina, the 20th Valeria Victrix Legion, and the 9th Hispania Legion. They sailed down the Rhine and picked up auxiliaries in Batavia and rounded the sea coast to northern Gaul. Right. They crossed the straits in 3 flotillas. They regrouped in Cantium, Kent, near their landing place. Plautius made inroads, and the Emperor Claudius, who had initiated, decided that there should be a conquest of Britain. He turned up to witness a decisive battle and to claim the glory. He stayed 16 days and returned to Rome to persuade the Senate to give him his triumph and to build him an arch, and then for him to take the name Britannicus, Claudius Britannicus, because he'd visited for 16 days and seen the decisive battle. The conquest proceeded year in and year out for 40 years. Modern Wales was reached by 47 AD. The exploits of the Second Legion Augusta under the future Emperor Vespasian are well known. The Romans made allies of some of the Celtic tribes, the Atrebati in the south, the Iceni in the east, and the Brigantes in the north, who didn't want to fight. But there was resistance, and here are some of the names. The most famous name, the most famous 2 names, Caractacus and Boudica, Boadicea. Caractacus in Welsh, Caradog, a name still used by people, still given to children, had faced Claudius on the Tamesis, the Thames, in 43 AD, and had seen his brother killed there. He moved westwards and trained the Silures tribe of South Wales to fight. They won a series of small battles against the Romans and avoided a big battle deliberately. The Romans built a strong fort at Glevum, Caerloyw in Welsh, Gloucester in English, near the territory of the Silures. Tacitus says that Caractacus, and the Silures were a problem for the legions for 8 long years along the border of territory that the Romans had not managed to conquer properly. They were held by the Ordovices of the north. Caradog's final battle was in 51 AD. He decided to have a battle somewhere in mid-Wales by the River Severn in the territory of the Ordovices. Tacitus describes the battle. Caradog was caught and taken prisoner to Rome with his wife. He said, "Of course you want to rule the whole world, but you cannot expect those whom you have conquered to rejoice with you in your success." And he added, on seeing the glorious buildings of imperial Rome, "Why do you who have these palaces covet my poor mud hut?" Caradog's dignity and bravery made such an impression on the emperor that he decided to free him and his wife and family to live the remainder of their days on a pension in Rome. Secondly, Boudica, Boadicea, was queen of the Iceni tribe. She was the wife of a Roman ally. Her husband's kingdom had been plundered after his death. In 60 or 61, in the reign of Nero, the Iceni, provoked beyond endurance by pitiless tax collectors and the greedy procurator, Decianus Catus, rose up. Venutius made a last stand at a great fortress in the north, and Boudica resisted the first legion. Tacitus says that 70,000 people died. The Roman province of Britain was brought almost to collapse. Eventually, the governor, Suetonius Paulinus, rallied the remaining legions and defeated Boudica's army and set his men on an even greater rampage, during which 80,000 dead were counted. But there also took place an ideological battle. The Romans built a huge temple to the deified Claudius at Camulodunum. In 60 to 61, and conclusively in 78 to 79, action was taken to break the power of the Druids on Mona, Anglesey. Tacitus describes the conquest of Mona, of Anglesey. Here we are, here's the Roman army crossing Anglesey. Ynys Môn on the left there means the Isle of Anglesey. And on the right is the mainland of Wales. This is quite a good map. Okay, and the next one too, Father, I think is the same. Well, that's, yes. Have we got the thumbnails? Well, we'll leave it at with that, because that's a good man. If you can, in the meantime, go back to thumbnail so I can identify. So the conqueror was Suetonius Paulinus in 60 AD, 9 years after Caractacus' defeat. Anglesey was the stronghold of the Druids, the leaders of the pagan religion, who were very influential spiritual and religious leaders, and who, of course, practiced barbaric pagan practices like human sacrifice, for example. But the Romans realized they had to defeat these leaders. And Mona, Anglesey, which is very flat land, unlike the north part of Wales, which is mountainous, was very good agricultural land and supplied food for the Ordovices, who lived in barren mountainous lands. So if the Ordovices were to be conquered, Anglesey had to be conquered because it was the supply of food for them. And also many Celts had fled to Anglesey for protection. The Menai Straits, which separate Anglesey from the mainland, are treacherous, although shallow. They're now connected by two bridges built in the 19th century. Suetonius Paulinus' soldiers built a fleet of flat-bottomed ships to cross the straits. The horsemen followed on horseback, the horses swimming when the water became deep. On the shores of Mona, Anglesey, stood rows of intimidating Celts, amongst them women with their wild hair and dressed in black, brandishing torches. These reminded the Romans of their goddesses of vengeance. Nearby was a crowd of religious leaders, druids dressed in white, raising their arms aloft and screaming terrifying curses. The soldiers were almost too terrified to cross, but their leaders urged them on, saying, "Come, Romans, this is a show to frighten us. These are but ignorant barbarians. We'll show them that we're not afraid of them." The soldiers landed and defeated the Celts, slaying many druids and utterly destroying their ritual groves. But before Suetonius Paulinus was able to celebrate his victory, he had to go east to fight against Bidig, Boudica. So that was an important part of the whole conquest. This map shows the Roman Empire after the conquest of Britain. As you see, Ireland is untouched. The Romans were never in Ireland, and they were not in the north part of Scotland because a wall was built, Hadrian's Wall, and later his son built the Antonian Wall, Antoninus Pius, as His Grace said yesterday. Referred to Antoninus Pius. Julius Agricola recorded the campaigns of the conquest. He was the governor of Britannia from 77 or 78 to 83 or 84. He was born in Forum Julii in southern Gaul, educated in Massilia, twice served as a soldier in Britannia, and Vespasian the emperor made him consul, the governor of Britain. He clearly intended to subdue all the isles, and in 78 he reduced the Ordovices, the last tribe still holding out in the western military zone. In 79 he moved out of Diva, Chester, on the first of 5 campaigns against the Caledonians of the north. The Caledonians of the north were a British tribe. They're not the contemporary Scots. The Scots, as we call them, haven't yet arrived. He sent ships round the North Cape to survey the coasts, and he broke Caledonian resistance decisively in the highlands of what we now call Scotland. He wanted to subdue Ireland, but was recalled. We know all about him because Tacitus married his daughter, and this is what Tacitus says: "Looting, killing, and raping, by twisting their words they call it empire, and wherever they have created a wilderness, they call it peace." As Gibbon says in The Decline and Fall, after a war of about 40 years, undertaken by the most stupid, maintained by the most dissolute, and terminated by the most timid of all emperors, the greater part of the islands submitted to Roman yoke. In 122, the Emperor Hadrian visited Britannia and stayed for the best part of the year. It was part of his 11-year tour of the empire, visiting every province, pacifying, building, legislating, and making extensive administrative and legal reforms. There is one solitary mention of Hadrian's Wall in ancient literature. Hence, having reformed the soldiery in regal manner, he travelled to Britannia. There he put a great many things in order, and was the first to build a wall of 80 Roman miles length, which would divide the Romans from the barbarians. It was constructed in the years following 122. It was the end of the empire. Beyond it lay the Picts. The emperor's visit inspired the minting of 3 commemorative coins, and when the wall was completed, an imposing monument was set into it near its eastern end. 2 important fragments of the inscription survive. From then on, the province of Britannia was well and truly established. I've left, Father, some notes on the saints in my room. I wonder, you'll find them on the desk there. It says introducing saints. And no, they're left there. I wonder if you could bring the file.
These are the thumbnails for this.
For this. Well, you can show, yes, more of these islands.
Where did you say they were?
They're on the desk in the room, yes. You can show more of these. These are the straits between the mainland and Anglesey, connected with the conquest by the Romans of the Druids. Yes.
How large is Anglesey?
Anglesey, about 30 miles in length, 30 miles in width. Yes.
And are there many settlements on it now?
Yes, there are many towns, yes, and very big secondary schools, with 1,000 or 1,500 in each school, 4 or 5 big schools in every village. This is Anglesey, opposite. This is the mainland. We took these photographs 2 weeks ago from the mainland. Anglesey opposite. This is, yes, that's the area where I originate from. That parish church is the church of the village where I was not born, but conceived. And here we are, the straits. We're looking westward now towards the Irish Sea, towards the Atlantic. There we are again. Okay, so the Isles of Britain, excluding Ireland, have been conquered and Roman rule has been established. Roman Britannia was divided into 2 distinct zones, the occupied Roman one and the unoccupied non-Roman one, in other words, beyond the wall. Each of these could be divided into various sub-zones. The Roman province first. A large lowland zone in the south and east, in other words, near Kent and England, and the capital of England, London, and 2 highland zones, the north, what we now call Scotland, and the west, what we now call Wales. But these names are not applicable at this time.